Hi, my name is Fabio Oliveira. I'm Layla Mahoney's mom. I'm 38 years old. I am a Brazilian immigrant. I moved to the United States when I was 2 years old with my parents, Tony and Lydia Oliveira. The reason that my parents decided to come to America has a lot to do with what my dad's idea of what his life would be. He joined the military police when he was 16 years old. He was from a really small farm town in Brazil, and he had taken an English class that somebody had offered to the small school there. And from that point on, he said he had envisioned his life would be in the United States. He said he had envisioned that his children would grow up in another country knowing English. And my mom, I think, didn't really have that same ambition, but she was curious about going to America because in that time, Brazil was having a very difficult economic downfall. People were having to buy milk on layaway, which is when you pay a little bit at a time for one item, because agriculturally everything got really expensive. Pay there only happens once a month, so it's really difficult to budget as well. And once they got together and they started to envision what they wanted for their lives, they both sort of fed into this dream of coming to the United States. I was too young to remember my immigration experience, but I know from my parents, my father came here about 3 months before my mother, my brother, and I to find work and to sort of establish himself before sending for us. I know from my mom that her travel experience was really difficult because once arriving in New York and going through customs, she realized she didn't know how to read any of the questions. In the 80s, there was no Spanish translation or translator help. Everything was in English. So she said it took her a total of 3 hours from the time she got off the plane to get to baggage to then get to my father, who was waiting with people who had rented a van to pick us up. And she'd said that the family who was driving my dad, because he didn't have a vehicle yet, kept insisting that she didn't make it across, that she got sent back and to leave. And my dad refused to believe it. He just kept saying, "No, I know she's coming out. I know she's coming out." So it was a really difficult travel experience for my mom, who did not have the language that my dad had, and even my dad's language was pretty limited. So that was difficult too. I would say the way that migration impacted both our family here in the United States and the family that was left in Brazil, by and large, is economically. The money that my parents were able to make here was money that they sent back home. And with that support, I have aunts and uncles who I later met who proudly showed me the building they were living in that said, "Your father paid for this." Or the salon that they opened and said, "Your mother's money helped us open this." The value of the dollar was so much higher than the money then, which was at that point called cruzeiros. Now it's called reais. On the other end of that, living in the States and specifically in Massachusetts, it's a very expensive state. So we struggled financially. Rent was much, much cheaper back in Somerville in these days. I think it was something like $300 a month. And even then they would be in apartments that had a lot of rooms and they would rent these rooms out. So one of our first places that we lived was on Flint Street. And I remember I shared a room with my parents and my brother. So the four of us all shared one room in this apartment because that's how they were able to afford living in a house, sort of like communal living. They started cleaning as soon as they came to the States. They got jobs working overnight cleaning buildings, offices, and then my dad worked for a construction company, worked for Popeyes, and we had a neighbor who was also Brazilian, was also a cleaner, but he had started his own business. And when he was returning to Brazil, he said to my parents that he wanted to sell them his business. They took it over, I want to say, in 1996, and they have been working for the same clients ever since. You can see this picture of my mom wearing a blue apron that has the cleaning company's logo, and she's sitting on a stone wall with some flowers behind her. And I've gone and helped clean that house with them in the last year. So there was always this feeling that it was not going to be permanent, that our experience here was going to be transient, it was going to be temporary. So I think that influenced my mom's sort of decision to not learn the language, to not assimilate with the culture, because she didn't think that she would be here long term. And then I think over time, sort of as an act of resistance, she flat out refused. And so she ensured that I spoke Portuguese fluently. She only spoke Portuguese in the home, even years into living here. I would say my experience learning English was unique in the fact that I was 2 years old when we first came here, so I wasn't in any sort of school. All of our community were Portuguese speakers, and so the way my mom says it is that I would hear people speaking English on the street, and I then sort of took it upon myself to learn from watching TV. And then when I was about 3.5, there was a program called Head Start, which is a low-income, federally funded program for preschool-age children. And that was the beginning of my language development. And then, over time, my parents tried to increase their own English use, but again, they were still very deeply in a Portuguese-speaking community, so they didn't have all of that exposure the way that I did. I did a lot of translating documents, speaking on their behalf at, for bill collectors and such, and doing things that were definitely not age appropriate, but it was just the only way that we could. We didn't have resources like translators readily available to us. So I would say when I was old enough to recognize that yes, there was some discrimination happening, especially with things like landlords and people renting apartments to us. There was sort of a hesitancy to have Brazilians in apartments. They worried about things like noise level or cleanliness, and sort of these preconceived notions of what immigrants would be like. But my parents were notoriously quiet. They didn't drink. They were church-going people. So I didn't understand that they might be looked at that way. But as I got older and I started hearing certain slur words that Hispanic people were called, or slang for immigrants from Latin American, was definitely a part of the experience. But also there's a huge population of Brazilian immigrants that had come in between the years of 1988 and 1996. There was a huge immigration from places like São Paulo or Minas Gerais. That was a big population. We were sort of insulated in that way, but definitely there was more Irish American, Italian Americans who were not always so welcoming. One of the places that we lived probably for the longest period was a short little building on Highland Ave across from the old Somerville High School. There I met a lot of kids my age or a little older, and we formed sort of like a tight-knit group. Some of the kids were from El Salvador, other kids were Italian Americans. There was another Brazilian family, and throughout the years we all went to the same elementary school together. So we really bonded over the fact that, well, one, we were neighbors living in the same building, we went to the same school. A lot of us had parents who were working long hours. We were what we were called a latchkey kid, where we'd have to let ourselves in after school, mind ourselves, find things to do until they got home sometime in the evening. And that was sort of a universal experience for all of us in that building at that time. I went to the Cummings School from first grade to eighth grade, and then I went to Somerville High School, and I graduated in 2005. I went to Bunker Hill Community College from 2006 until about 2009. It took me some time to finish my first degree, which is my associate's degree in human services, because I wasn't going full-time since I had Christian at home. By the time I finished in 2009, I was married and pregnant with Layla. And then another few years went by before I would go back to get my bachelor's degree in expressive arts therapy, because at the time I wanted to become an art therapist. By my senior year, I realized that I really just wanted to focus on my writing, so I applied for the graduate program also at Lesley University. And then I completed my master's degree in fine arts with a focus on creative nonfiction in 2017. I was really lucky to have some essays published in magazines and anthologies, and I was really fortunate to win a couple of fellowships to places like Portugal and New York, where I got to be among other writers. And I think part of why I really wanted to pursue my writing was because I found over time that I had a story I wanted to tell, and a lot of it had to do with being a first-generation immigrant. Much of my writing, in fact, is about that. And I became a young mom just after finishing high school, and so that sort of changed the trajectory of how I would have accomplished my education goals. But in fact, it changed. It didn't completely stop it changed. And I was really fortunate to have my parents' support, and as well as Layla's grandparents' support, so that I could pursue my education to make sure I have more financial security for myself and for you guys at home. I think immigrant stories are extremely important to hear because America is founded on the idea that people from anywhere can come here and live the life that they want and that they dream of. It's part of what inspires people from all over the world to pick up and leave something that they've known forever, to come here and start over, to struggle, to maybe not be accepted, because you feel it's worth it because of the opportunities. Massachusetts in particular has incredible healthcare, health insurance, education. There's just so much opportunity that if you live here, if you grow up here and you don't ever live anywhere else, you can take for granted because you don't know any different. But if you, like me, have parents who have lived entire other lives in other countries, they will make it a point to let you know just how lucky you are and how different circumstances were for them, and how, not less, but how different the opportunities were. And maybe education wouldn't have been such a priority for me had I lived back in Brazil. So many things could have been different in my life if they hadn't immigrated here. And I think that there is a shared hope that people who choose to immigrate, hold on to, which is that you can make your life what you want it to be. And they're willing to be uncomfortable. They're willing to feel unwelcome somewhere in order to give maybe the next generation a chance to then assimilate and be part of that world that maybe they never get to be fully. And that's, I mean, I think it's a beautiful sacrifice. I think it's one that changes the course of generations, and this country, for all its faults, is somewhere that really is a land of opportunity, really is a land of freedom. It's invaluable.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you doing this.
You're welcome. I'm happy to help.